Have you ever stopped to think that some of the things we use every single day might have come from some pretty unexpected places? Innovations created during the Nazi era that ended up influencing what we consume today. It might sound strange, but the truth is that some of these inventions were responsible for changes that reached us in a really quiet way, without us even realizing it. Creations that emerged in one of the darkest periods in history, and that, in some way, are still present in our lives. These are things created under the Nazi regime that you are about to see today. Modern computers, the ones we use today, started taking shape right in the midst of the Second World War because of the need to handle secret messages and complex calculations. The Axis used the famous Enigma machine, which encrypted their communications, and that led the British to develop the Colossus in 1943. It was the first electronic computer in the world built to decipher Enigma's codes. Across the Atlantic, the United States was also investing heavily in technology. The Harvard Mark I, used in the Manhattan Project, was one of the first electromechanical computers. Then came the ENIAC, finished in 1946, considered the first modern computer, able to carry out calculations at an impressive speed for its time. But it wasn't only in the Allied countries that technological advances took place. In Germany, a man named Konrad Zuse was revolutionizing computing. In 1938, he built the Z1, the first binary digital computer. A few years later, in 1941, he presented the Z3, which was the first program-controlled electromechanical digital computer. Zuse kept innovating, even in the midst of wartime chaos. He developed the Z4, which would become the world's first commercial computer, and also created the Plankalkül, the first high-level programming language. A lot of people have no idea, but Zuse pioneered several areas of computing. He even suggested back in 1969 the idea that the universe might function like a vast computational system. Pretty advanced thinking for that era. Much of his work was funded by his family and by industry, but starting in 1939, he received support from the Nazi government. Because of the war, Zuse's contributions went largely unnoticed in the United Kingdom and the United States. But in 1946, IBM recognized his importance and licensed his patents. To sum it up, plenty of the technology we use today got a boost from that tumultuous period in history. When you step onto a commercial airplane today, you probably don't realize that the technology behind jet engines started taking shape during the Second World War in Nazi Germany. It all began with the need to create something that would give the Germans an edge in aerial combat. That's how the Messerschmitt Me 262 was born, the first jet fighter in the world. The Me 262 was completely revolutionary for its time. While traditional planes depended on propeller engines, it used turbines that compressed and burned air to generate thrust, allowing it to reach speeds of around 870 kilometers per hour. This was an impressive feat, far superior to the propeller-driven fighters the Allies had back then. Beyond its speed, the Me 262's design was so advanced, it looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Even though it showed up late in the war, the Me 262 demonstrated the immense potential of jet technology. After Germany's defeat, the Allies didn't ignore this progress. The United States and the Soviet Union quickly brought German engineers, scientists, and designs over to study and develop their own jet aircraft. That kicked off a technological revolution in aviation. From those studies in the 1950s, jet engine technology began to be adapted to commercial airplanes. Models like the de Havilland Comet and the Boeing 707 appeared as a direct result of the innovations the Germans had started. These days, almost every passenger plane uses jet engines, direct descendants of what was developed during the Second World War. The Beetle, one of the most iconic cars in history, only became a global success thanks to Adolf Hitler. Yes, the Nazi dictator played a direct part in creating the so-called People's Car. The idea arose in the 1930s, when Germany was financially devastated, and very few people had access to automobiles. Hitler wanted to change that, to create an affordable car for German families, and at the same time show the strength of the regime. That's where Ferdinand Porsche, a famous engineer at the time, came in. Hitler hired him to develop an economical, sturdy, and practical car, one that could carry 2 adults and 3 children, or, in wartime, 3 soldiers and a machine gun. The result was the very first Beetle prototype, created in 1936. In 1938, it began official production under the name KDF Wagen, an acronym for Strength Through Joy. The model was sold in a curious way. People had to collect stamp cards to guarantee the car. But plans were interrupted when the war started. The factory was shifted to produce military vehicles, like the amphibious ones the German army used on the front lines. After the war, the Beetle almost disappeared, but the British, who were in control of occupied Germany, saw its potential. They restarted production and began exporting it. That's when the car earned the nickname Beetle, thanks to its rounded shape. In Brazil, it arrived in 1950 and quickly won people over. Volkswagen assembled the car with imported parts until, in 1959, it opened its first factory in São Bernardo do Campo, in Brazil. From that point on, the Beetle became a real phenomenon. It was one of the most produced and best-selling cars in the world, eventually becoming a symbol of automotive culture. Nazi propaganda was one of Hitler's most powerful weapons, and believe it or not, plenty of what we see today in marketing and communication strategies has roots in that era. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he created the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels. Their mission was simple but terrifying: spread the Nazi ideology everywhere, using every medium available: films, books, music, radio, newspapers, theater, and even school materials. The main goal was to convince Germans of the supposed superiority of the Aryan race and create clear enemies, such as Jews, communists, and other minorities. Even before the Nuremberg Laws, in 1935, propaganda was already preparing people to accept atrocities. They created an environment where violence against Jews was almost justified. Cinema played a huge role in this process. Movies like Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, practically turned Hitler into a divine figure. Productions like The Eternal Jew portrayed Jewish people as dangerous and inhuman threats. Meanwhile, newspapers like Der Stürmer reinforced prejudice with hateful caricatures and writing. When the Second World War began, the propaganda's tone changed. The new focus was justifying Germany's actions. They developed narratives to convince the population that they were defending Western culture from Soviet communism and that their territorial claims were more than justified. Propaganda was even used in concentration camps. In Theresienstadt, for instance, the Nazis dolled up the place to fool international inspectors and even recorded films to show that Jews were supposedly being well treated. In the end, Nazi propaganda was key to manipulating millions of people, ensuring their support or at least their silence in the face of atrocities. What's worse is that many of the tactics invented back then still show up today, hidden in campaigns, speeches, and methods of manipulation. In the 1930s, Coca-Cola was already the most popular drink in Germany, selling millions of crates every year. With the rise of the Nazi regime, the brand expanded, building around 50 factories throughout the country. Everything was going well until the start of the Second World War, in 1939. Once the war began, things got complicated. The Atlantic was blocked, and the essential syrup for producing Coca-Cola, which was imported from the United States, became impossible to obtain. By 1941, when the United States entered the war, trade ties between the two countries were cut off for good. Without the syrup, the Germans simply couldn't produce Coca-Cola anymore. That's when Max Keith, head of the German branch, decided to improvise. He needed to create an alternative, using whatever was available locally. He mixed whey, apple fibers, practically leftovers from the food industry, along with sugar and carbonated water. The result was a totally different soda. All it needed was a name. During the meeting to name the new drink, Keith told everyone to use their imagination, or, as he said in German, fantasy. That's when Joe Knipp, one of the salespeople, blurted out, "Fanta!" The name was approved on the spot. The drink caught on with the German public and became a hit. Besides drinking it as a soda, people started using it in cake and dessert recipes. The idea also made its way to the Netherlands, which was occupied by Germany at the time. There, Fanta had a different formula, made with the elderberry fruit, typical of Europe. After the war, once Coca-Cola production returned to normal, Fanta was discontinued, but customers hadn't forgotten it, and in 1955, Coca-Cola brought Fanta back, now as a fruit-flavored soda. It was in Italy that the orange flavor, still the most famous one, first appeared. Today, Fanta is sold in over 100 countries, and it has more than 90 different flavors. What started as a war necessity ended up becoming a global phenomenon. That item we use in deodorants, hairsprays, insecticides, and even air fresheners has its roots in the Nazi period. During the Second World War, the Nazis needed efficient ways to apply chemical substances on a large scale. That's where the idea of the aerosol began to take shape. The technology allowed liquids to be transformed into very small droplets by means of pressure, which was perfect for military use. The Nazi regime was always investing in technological advances to try to gain an edge in the conflict. After the war, this technology was adapted for civilian use, especially in the United United States. Many innovations developed or improved during the Nazi era ended up being taken in by other countries, sometimes through espionage, sometimes by German scientists who were brought over to work on Allied projects. The aerosol spray was one such example. Nowadays, it's become indispensable in many industries. Who would have thought that a tool with such a grim past would end up turning into something so necessary? Sure, the original context was totally different, but there's no denying that the technical breakthroughs of that time ended up forming the basis of products we still use today. The most curious part of all this is how something initially designed for war found its way into such everyday items, like freshening your home or styling your hair. The first live television broadcast of an event took place at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Back then, television was still in its infancy, and the Nazis used the Olympics to showcase not just their technology, but also the regime's overall power. They wanted to impress the world, to show that Germany was on the cutting edge of technology and social control. The broadcast was very different from what we know today. It wasn't sent straight into homes, the way it might be today by the internet or cable TV. The images were transmitted to specific locations, like theaters and cafes, where people gathered to watch live. The idea, more than just showing the games themselves, was to use the event as undercover propaganda to display Nazi Germany's strength. The 1936 Berlin Olympics broadcast was a huge showcase of that era's technology, but it also served to reinforce the regime's propaganda. Even so, the concept of broadcasting live events caught on over time, and today, it's part of our daily lives. But think about it. When you watch a soccer match or follow a live stream online, you're taking in something that started way back at the 1936 Olympics. Despite the whole context, the idea of airing something live spread around the globe and ended up changing how we consume information and entertainment. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.